In the autumn of 1848, construction workers in Salem, Massachusetts began to demolish the abandoned St. Mary's Academy for young ladies. What they discovered there would haunt the town for generations. Sealed in a lead-lined box, hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, were 47 small leather journals. Each bore the name of a different girl. Contained within the pages were detailed accounts of unspeakable horrors. Yet what terrified investigators most were the client records, kept with such meticulous care, listing names that read like a who's who of New England's political elite. Citing public safety concerns, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts immediately sealed the findings. To this day, those records remain classified in the state archives. What I'm about to tell you comes from testimonies never meant to see the light of day, from documents that powerful families tried desperately to bury, and from the dying confession of a woman who carried these secrets for 60 years. If you seek the truth behind America's darkest secrets, if you aren't afraid to peer into the shadows of our nation's past, then this story is for you. But I must warn you what happened at St. Mary's Academy challenges. Everything we thought we knew about respectability, power, and innocence in 19th century New England. Before we descend into this abyss of human corruption, hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to uncover the mysteries others dare not tell. Let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this horror could have happened anywhere. Now, let me take you back to a time when evil wore the mask of virtue. Salem, Massachusetts, in 1811, was a city still haunted by its infamous past, and yet determined to reinvent itself as a beacon of moral righteousness and educational progress. The witch trials of 1692 had left an indelible stain on the community's reputation. By the early 19th century, Salem's leading families were desperately seeking ways to restore their town's standing in the eyes of New England society. Into this atmosphere of redemption and reinvention arrived the Fairfax family, carrying with them impeccable credentials and a vision that would captivate the town's elite. Victoria Fairfax was a woman of remarkable presence. Tall, elegant, with steel, gray eyes that seemed to peer directly into one's soul. Born to a wealthy Virginia plantation family, she had received the finest education available to women of her station, studying literature and languages in Philadelphia before spending 2 years in London absorbing the latest educational philosophies. Her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, had died in a yellow fever outbreak in Charleston, leaving her widowed at 32 with a substantial inheritance and a burning desire to dedicate her life to the moral elevation of young womanhood. When Victoria announced her intention to establish St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, the town's Congregationalist leadership embraced her vision with enthusiasm. Here was a woman of obvious refinement and Christian virtue, offering to provide free education to orphaned and impoverished girls, while also accepting paying students from respectable families. The academy would teach not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also music, French, needlework, and most importantly, moral instruction rooted in Protestant values. The building Victoria selected for her academy had a history as complicated as Salem itself. The imposing 3-story Georgian mansion on Beacon Hill had been constructed in 1787 by merchant Samuel Hartwell, who had made his fortune in the China trade. After Hartwell's death in 1809, the property had stood empty, its dark windows overlooking Salem Harbor like dead eyes. Local residents whispered that the house was cursed. 3 different families had attempted to live there, and each had fled within months, citing strange sounds and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down upon them, like a physical weight. But Victoria Fairfax showed no fear of such superstitions. She purchased the property for a fraction of its assessed value, and immediately began extensive renovations. Workmen added a chapel wing complete with stained glass windows depicting scenes from the lives of female saints. They constructed dormitories that could house 30 girls, a dining hall that could seat 50, and most notably, a series of private chambers on the 3rd floor that Victoria described as meditation rooms where students could reflect on their spiritual development in solitude. Joining Victoria in her noble endeavor were 2 family members who shared her passion for education and moral guidance. Evangeline Fairfax, Victoria's younger sister, was a delicate woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that trembled slightly when she spoke, a condition she attributed to a childhood fever. Despite her fragile appearance, Evangeline possessed a remarkable gift for music and languages, and she would serve as the Academy's primary instructor in these subjects. Her voice, when she sang hymns during chapel services, was said to be so beautiful that even the most hardened sailors would pause in their work to listen. When the sound drifted down from the Academy's windows, the 3rd member of the Fairfax triumvirate was Bartholomew Fairfax, Victoria's brother-in-law, a man whose presence seemed to cast a shadow even in bright sunlight. Tall and gaunt, with deep, set eyes and a voice that carried the authority of absolute conviction, Bartholomew had spent 15 years as a traveling preacher throughout the southern states before answering Victoria's call to serve as the Academy's chaplain. His sermons on the corruption of the modern world and the special vulnerability of young women to Satan's temptations were legendary throughout the region. Parents who heard him speak felt both terrified for their daughters' spiritual welfare and grateful that such a vigilant guardian would be watching over them at St. Mary's. The Academy officially opened its doors on September 15, 1811, with great fanfare. Salem's mayor attended the dedication ceremony, along with several state legislators, and the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Victoria's opening address, delivered from the steps of the Academy, as autumn leaves swirled around her black silk dress, spoke of creating a sanctuary of learning where young ladies could develop both intellectual accomplishment and moral strength, protected from the corrupting influences of a world increasingly driven by commerce and vice. The first students to enter St. Mary's Academy were a carefully selected group of 23 girls ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some came from respectable Salem families who paid the substantial tuition of $50 per year, a sum that represented several months' wages for a working man. But Victoria's stated mission was to serve those less fortunate, and more than half of the initial enrollment consisted of orphans and daughters of impoverished families accepted without charge as demonstrations of the Academy's Christian charity. Among these charity students was 14-year-old Margaret Sullivan, whose Irish immigrant parents had died in a tenement fire the previous winter. Margaret was a bright, spirited girl with red hair and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. She had been working in a textile mill for 6 months when a representative of the Academy approached her with an offer that seemed too good to be true: free room, board, and education in exchange for helping with domestic duties around the Academy. Another was 15-year-old Priscilla Morse, whose father had been lost at sea and whose mother had died of consumption, leaving her in the care of an uncle who made it clear that her presence was an unwelcome burden. Priscilla was quiet and serious, with dark hair that she wore in a severe bun and a habit of reading any book she could find. The prospect of attending a real school with access to a library and qualified teachers seemed like an answered prayer. The third was 13-year-old Hannah Whitmore, perhaps the most tragic case of all. Hannah's father had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison, while her mother had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note saying she could no longer bear the shame. Hannah had been living in the Salem poor house when Victoria Fairfax personally visited and offered her a place at the academy. The girl's pale, hollow-cheeked face had brightened for the first time in months when she learned she would have her own bed, regular meals, and the chance to learn to read properly. These girls, along with their 20 classmates, entered St. Mary's Academy with hearts full of hope and gratitude. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap, that the woman who promised to protect their virtue was about to steal their innocence, and that the elegant Georgian mansion overlooking Salem Harbor would become their prison, their nightmare, and for many of them, their tomb. The first hint that something was amiss at St. Mary's Academy came not from the students themselves, but from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who lived in a modest cottage at the base of Beacon Hill. Mrs. Thornton had been commissioned to provide linens and clothing for the academy, and her weekly deliveries gave her occasion to observe the daily routines of the institution from a distance. It was on a gray October morning in 1812, exactly 13 months after the academy's opening, that Mrs. Thornton first noticed something peculiar. She had arrived earlier than usual to deliver a shipment of winter cloaks and was surprised to see several well-dressed gentlemen departing from the academy's side entrance, the same entrance that led directly to the private chambers on the 3rd floor. What struck her as odd was not merely their early morning departure, but their obvious efforts to avoid being seen. They moved quickly to waiting carriages, keeping their heads down and their hat brims low over their faces. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Thornton began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the academy. She noticed that these mysterious visitors always arrived after dark and always used the side entrance. Sometimes there would be only 1 or 2 carriages, other nights she counted as many as 6. The vehicles bore no identifying marks, but even in the dim light of gas lamps, she could see they were expensive, the kind owned by merchants, politicians, or other men of substantial means. More disturbing still were the changes she observed in the students themselves. The girls who had entered the academy with bright faces and eager expressions were becoming increasingly withdrawn and hollow-eyed. During her deliveries, Mrs. Thornton would occasionally catch glimpses of them through windows, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Many appeared listless and moved with a strange, dreamlike quality, as if they were walking through water. Some bore visible marks, bruises on their arms that were hastily concealed beneath long sleeves, cuts on their hands that were explained away as needlework accidents. The transformation was most noticeable in Margaret Sullivan, the spirited Irish girl who had once chatted excitedly about her studies whenever Mrs. Thornton encountered her. By winter, Margaret rarely spoke at all. Her vibrant red hair had become dull and lifeless, hanging in limp strands around a face that had grown gaunt and pale. When she did meet Mrs. Thornton's eyes, there was something desperate in her gaze, as if she were trying to communicate a message she dared not speak aloud. It was on the night of December 13th, 1812, that Mrs. Thornton witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Unable to sleep due to a persistent cough, she had risen from her bed around midnight to brew some chamomile tea. As she stood by her kitchen window, waiting for the water to boil, she noticed unusual activity at the academy. Light flickered in the 3rd floor windows, not the steady glow of candles or oil lamps, but an erratic, dancing illumination that suggested torches or perhaps a small fire. At first, She assumed someone was simply reading late or tending to a sick student. But then she heard sounds that made her blood run, cold, muffled screaming that seemed to come from the academy's chapel. The sounds were intermittent, lasting only a few seconds at a time, but they were unmistakably human and unmistakably expressions of agony or terror. As Mrs. Thornton pressed her face against the cold window glass, straining to see more clearly, the chapel windows glowed with that same strange, flickering light, and she could make out shadowy figures moving inside. The screaming continued sporadically for nearly an hour, punctuated by periods of silence that were somehow even more unsettling than the sounds themselves. When morning came, Mrs. Thornton convinced herself that she must have been mistaken, that her fever and exhaustion had caused her to imagine things. But when she made her next delivery to the academy 3 days later, she learned that one of the students, young Hannah Whitmore, had died suddenly during the night of December 13th. Victoria Fairfax, dressed in mourning clothes that somehow made her appear more imposing than grieving, explained that the girl had succumbed to a sudden fever despite the best efforts of the academy's physician. The funeral was held the following morning in the academy's chapel, a small, private service attended only by the faculty and students. Mrs. Thornton was not invited, but she could hear the hymns drifting down from the hill, sung in voices that seemed more fearful than mournful. Evangeline Fairfax's beautiful soprano rose above the others, but even her angelic voice could not mask the underlying note of desperation that seemed to permeate the entire performance. Hannah Whitmore was buried in the small cemetery behind the academy, marked with a simple stone cross bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. No family members attended the service because she had no family left, a fact that Victoria Fairfax noted with what might have been satisfaction rather than sorrow. In the weeks that followed Hannah's death, Mrs. Thornton noticed that several other students seemed to be ailing. They moved more slowly, spoke even less frequently, and displayed the same listless behavior that had characterized Hannah in her final days. When she discreetly inquired about their health, Victoria Fairfax assured her that the girls were simply experiencing the normal effects of intensive academic study combined with the moral discipline necessary for their spiritual development. Young ladies of their unfortunate backgrounds, Victoria explained in her crisp, cultured voice, often require significant adjustment before they can fully embrace the refined way of life we provide here. Some find the transition more challenging than others. But Mrs. Thornton's suspicions were not so easily dismissed. She began to take careful note of which students appeared to be struggling, and she noticed a disturbing patterns. The girls who seemed most affected were invariably among the poorest, those who had no families to inquire about their welfare or financial resources to leave the academy if they chose. The paying students, while certainly more subdued than when they had first arrived, maintained better color in their cheeks and greater alertness in their eyes. The pattern became impossible to ignore when, in February of 1813, 2 more students died within a single week. Priscilla Morse, the quiet girl who had loved to read, was found dead in her bed on a Tuesday morning, apparently having passed away peacefully in her sleep. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien, another Irish orphan, succumbed to what was described as brain fever, after a brief illness characterized by violent convulsions. Both girls were buried in the academy cemetery with the same simple ceremony that had marked Hannah's passing. Their deaths were reported to the town authorities, but since to Dr. Edmund Fairfax, Bartholomew's cousin, served as both the academy's physician and the official coroner for that district. The deaths were officially attributed to natural causes without further investigation. Mrs. Thornton found herself torn between her growing suspicions and her awareness that she was just a simple seamstress with no evidence beyond her own observations. Who would believe her if she suggested that something sinister was happening at Salem's most prestigious academy for young ladies? Victoria Fairfax was respected throughout the community, praised for her charitable work and her dedication to education. The academy received regular visits from local clergy and civic leaders, all of whom spoke glowingly of the institution's mission and achievements. Yet she could not shake the image of those flickering lights in the chapel windows, or the memory of those muffled screams echoing through the December night. Something terrible was happening on Beacon Hill, something that the respectable Fas. 8 of St. Mary's Academy was designed to conceal. But it would be years before the truth began to emerge, and when it did, the reality would prove to be far more horrific than even Mrs. Thornton's darkest suspicions had imagined. By the spring of 1813, a strange quietude had settled over St. Mary's Academy for young ladies, as if the very walls had absorbed the sorrow and secrets within them, and now emanated an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even ordinary sounds. The death of 3 students within 4 months had cast a pall over the institution. Yet life continued with a routine that suggested these losses were merely unfortunate interruptions in the Academy's noble mission, rather than symptoms of something far more sinister. Victoria Fairfax adapted to these tragedies with what observers noted as remarkable composure. Rather than allowing grief to overwhelm her, she seemed to draw strength from adversity, speaking frequently about the spiritual trials that God sent to test the faithful, and the importance of viewing earthly suffering as preparation for heavenly reward. Her sermons to the remaining students took on an increasingly intense quality, dwelling on themes of sacrifice, submission, and the necessity of absolute obedience to those whom God had placed in authority over them. "Young ladies," she would intone from the chapel pulpit, her steel, gray eyes sweeping across the assembled students like a blade cutting through silk, "you must understand that your previous lives of poverty, abandonment, and moral confusion, have left marks upon your souls that can only be cleansed through the most rigorous spiritual discipline. The path to redemption is not easy, and some among you may not possess the strength necessary to complete the journey. But for those who do, the rewards will be beyond earthly comprehension." The surviving students had learned to listen to these addresses with carefully composed expressions that revealed nothing of their inner thoughts. They had learned, through means both subtle and overt, that displays of emotion or independent thinking were not welcomed at St. Mary's Academy. Those who asked too many questions or showed too much curiosity about the Academy's operations found themselves assigned to increasingly unpleasant duties, scrubbing floors with lye soap that burned their hands, working in the Academy's garden during the hottest part of summer days, or spending long hours alone in the meditation rooms on the 3rd floor contemplating their sins and shortcomings. Margaret Sullivan, now 15 and barely recognizable as the spirited girl who had entered the Academy 18 months earlier, had become a master of this emotional concealment. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost haunting familiar halls, speaking only when spoken to and keeping her thoughts locked away behind eyes that had learned to reveal nothing. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Margaret's mind remained sharp and observant. She had begun to notice patterns in the Academy's routines that troubled her deeply. She had observed, for instance, that certain students were periodically selected for what Evangeline Fairfax called Special instruction. In the third-floor chambers. These sessions always took place in the evening, after regular classes had ended and the academy had settled into its nightly quiet. The girls chosen for such instruction would disappear upstairs immediately after dinner, often remaining there until well past midnight. When they returned to the dormitory, they moved with the same dreamlike quality that had characterized Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine in their final weeks. More disturbing still was Margaret's growing awareness that these special instruction sessions coincided with the visits of the mysterious gentlemen who arrived in unmarked carriages. Through careful observation, she had determined that the side entrance to the academy, the one that led directly to the third-floor chambers, was used exclusively during these nocturnal meetings. During daylight hours, all visitors used the main entrance and were received in the academy's formal parlor, where their business was conducted with appropriate supervision and ceremony. Margaret had also noticed that students who participated in multiple special instruction sessions began to display physical symptoms that went beyond mere fatigue. They would sit quietly during meals, picking at their food with little appetite, and many complained of persistent headaches and stomach ailments. Some developed a slight tremor in their hands that was remarkably similar to Evangeline Fairfax's own nervous condition. When questioned about these symptoms, Dr. Edmund Fairfax would diagnose them as manifestations of spiritual sensitivity, evidence that the girls' souls were becoming more receptive to divine influence as their earthly attachments were gradually purged away. The academy's routine during this period was rigidly structured, designed to eliminate any opportunity for the students to communicate freely among themselves or to develop relationships that might encourage independent thinking. The day began at 500 with chapel service, followed by a sparse breakfast of weak tea and bread. Classes ran from 700 in the morning until 600 in the evening, with only a brief break for a midday meal of thin soup and more bread. Evenings were devoted to moral instruction, lengthy sessions in which Bartholomew Fairfax would read from specially selected religious texts while the students sat in absolute silence, forbidden from asking questions or making comments. This schedule left the girls exhausted and isolated, unable to form the bonds of friendship that might have provided comfort or strength in the face of their increasingly dire circumstances. Those who attempted to communicate through whispered conversations or passed notes found themselves subjected to severe punishments that effectively discouraged further attempts at connection. Yet despite these precautions, information began to spread among the students through a network of subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully coded conversations that took place during supervised activities. Margaret Sullivan emerged as an unofficial leader in this underground communication system, using her position as one of the Academy's longest surviving students to gather and disseminate information about the institution's true nature. Through these covert channels, Margaret learned that the special instruction sessions involved more than religious education. Girls who had undergone these experiences described being given strange, tasting tea that made them feel dizzy and disoriented, followed by activities that they found difficult to remember clearly afterward. Some recalled being dressed in unusual clothing, white gowns that resembled burial shrouds rather than normal garments. Others remembered being required to participate in ceremonies that involved candles, incense, and recited prayers in languages they did not recognize. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of the gentlemen who attended these sessions. The girls described men of various ages, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, who spoke with the accents of education and refinement, but whose eyes held a hunger that made the students instinctively afraid. These men would observe the ceremonies from chairs arranged around the perimeter of the third floor chambers, sometimes participating in the prayers and rituals, but always maintaining an air of detached authority that suggested they were not merely observers, but active participants in whatever was taking place. As winter gave way to spring in 1813, Margaret began to understand that she and her fellow students were trapped in a situation far more dangerous than simple educational fraud or religious fanaticism. They were prisoners in an institution that presented itself as a sanctuary of learning and moral development, but functioned as something far more sinister, something that required the systematic destruction of young women's spirits, and, ultimately, their lives. The realization filled her with a mixture of terror and determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had survived longer than Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine, but she could see the same symptoms beginning to manifest in herself and others. The trembling hands, the persistent fatigue, the growing difficulty in concentrating on even simple tasks, all suggested that whatever process had claimed the lives of her friends was now claiming her as well. But Margaret Sullivan had not endured 2 years of poverty, abandonment, and suffering only to surrender without a fight. As the spring of 1813 progressed, she began to formulate a desperate plan. A plan that would either secure her freedom or ensure that the truth about St. Mary's Academy would not die with her. The Academy's carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to face its first serious challenge, though it would take years for the full extent of the Fairfax family's crimes to be revealed to the world. The opportunity Margaret Sullivan had been waiting for came in the form of Miss Constance Hartwell, a young woman whose arrival at St. Mary's Academy in September of 1813 would prove to be the catalyst for events that Victoria Fairfax could never have anticipated. Miss Hartwell was not a student, but a new instructor hired to teach mathematics and natural philosophy to the Academy's more advanced pupils. Her presence represented a significant departure from the Fairfax family's previous practice of keeping all educational duties within their immediate circle. Constance Hartwell was 24 years old, the daughter of a prosperous Boston merchant who had provided her with an education that was remarkable for its breadth and rigor. She had studied at Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York, where she had been exposed to progressive ideas about women's education and intellectual capabilities. Unlike the subdued, carefully controlled atmosphere that characterized St. Mary's Academy, Miss Willard's institution had encouraged critical thinking, independent research, and open discussion of complex ideas. Miss Hartwell had accepted the position at St. Mary's for reasons both practical and idealistic. The salary offered by Victoria Fairfax was generous, more than she could earn at any other educational institution in New England, and the opportunity to work with disadvantaged girls appealed to her strong sense of social responsibility. Her father had initially opposed her decision to work at all, believing that a woman of her social standing should focus on finding a suitable husband rather than pursuing a career. But Constance had inherited her father's stubborn determination, along with his sharp intellect, and she had convinced him that teaching would provide valuable experience in managing people and resources that would serve her well regardless of what path her life ultimately took. From her first day at the academy, Constance noticed inconsistencies that troubled her analytical mind. The students she had been assigned to teach were clearly intelligent, but they displayed a curious passivity that seemed at odds with their obvious capabilities. when she asked questions designed to stimulate discussion and critical thinking, she was met with blank stares and mechanical recitations of facts that suggested rote memorization rather than genuine understanding. More puzzling still was the students' apparent fear of expressing opinions or asking questions of their own. In her previous teaching experience, Constance had found that young women, when given permission to think freely, were naturally curious and eager to explore new ideas. But the girls at St. Mary's Academy seemed to have had all intellectual curiosity systematically suppressed, as if independent thought itself had been identified as a dangerous tendency that needed to be eliminated. During her first weeks at the academy, Constance attributed these observations to the rigorous religious discipline that clearly dominated the institution's culture. She had been raised in a devoutly Congregationalist household and understood the value of moral instruction and spiritual development. But as the autumn progressed, she began to suspect that something beyond ordinary religious education was responsible for the students' unusual behavior. The first concrete evidence of this came during a mathematics lesson in October, when she noticed that one of her brightest students, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Pitton, was having difficulty concentrating on relatively simple arithmetic problems. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked, and she frequently lost track of her calculations midway through solving them. When Constance gently inquired about her difficulties, Sarah's response was both revealing and disturbing. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously toward the classroom door, as if afraid of being overheard. "Sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a fog inside my head that makes it hard to think clearly. Dr. Fairfax says it's because my spirit is being purified, but I remember being able to think more clearly before I came here." This conversation planted the first seeds of serious concern in Constance's mind. She began to pay closer attention to the physical condition of her students, and what she observed alarmed her. Many displayed symptoms that reminded her of patients she had seen during a cholera outbreak in Boston the previous year. Not the specific symptoms of that disease, but the same general appearance of systemic poisoning. They were pale, listless, and frequently complained of headaches and stomach ailments. Several had developed the same tremor that affected Evangeline Fairfax, and most showed signs of significant weight loss despite the Academy's claims that they were receiving adequate nutrition. Constance's growing suspicions were confirmed when she discovered that her access to certain areas of the Academy was strictly limited. She had been assigned quarters on the second floor, but the third floor was declared off limits to all faculty except members of the Fairfax family. When she innocently inquired about using one of the third-floor rooms for private tutoring sessions, Victoria Fairfax's reaction was swift and decisive. "Miss Hartwell," Victoria said, her steel, gray eyes fixing Constance with an intensity that was both compelling and unsettling, "I'm sure you understand that an institution like ours must maintain certain boundaries and protocols. The third floor contains meditation chambers that are reserved for students undergoing advanced spiritual instruction. The atmosphere there is consecrated, you might say, and we cannot risk contaminating it with secular activities, no matter how well-intentioned." The firmness of this prohibition, combined with Victoria's obvious discomfort at having the subject raised, convinced Constance that the third floor held secrets that the Fairfax family was determined to protect. She began to observe the Academy's nighttime routines more carefully, noting the patterns of activity that Mrs. Thornton had witnessed from her cottage, but which were invisible to most residents of the Academy itself. It was during one of these covert observations that Constance first encountered Margaret Sullivan in circumstances that would forge an alliance between them. On a November evening, when rain drummed against the academy's windows and wind howled around its corners, Constance was returning from the library when she noticed a figure moving stealthily through the corridor that led to the side entrance. The figure was clearly one of the students, but she was not dressed in the standard gray wool dress that served as the academy's uniform. Instead, she wore a white gown that seemed to glow in the dim light of the corridor's oil lamps. Constance followed at a distance, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the hallway floors. She watched as the figure, whom she now recognized as Margaret Sullivan, approached the side entrance and pressed her ear against the door. Margaret remained in this position for several minutes, clearly listening to something happening on the other side, before turning and retracing her steps. When Margaret spotted Constance in the shadows, both young women froze, uncertain how to proceed. The moment stretched between them, fraught with mutual recognition that they had both been engaged in activities that would be severely punished if discovered. Finally, Margaret stepped forward, her green eyes meeting Constance's with an intensity that conveyed both desperation and determination. "Miss Hartwell," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. "I need to speak with you, but not here and not now. Tomorrow, during your mathematics class, ask me to stay after to discuss my work. I have things to tell you that you need to know." The following day's mathematics lesson passed with agonizing slowness. But finally the other students were dismissed, and Margaret remained behind as arranged. What she told Constance during the next hour would shatter the young teacher's assumptions about Stain, Mary's academy, and launch both women on a desperate quest for evidence that could expose the truth about the Fairfax family's crimes. Margaret's account was both detailed and horrifying. She described the special instruction sessions in clinical terms that suggested she had been observing and analyzing the academy's operations with the systematic approach of a trained investigator. She explained the pattern of student deaths, the mysterious nighttime visitors, and the growing evidence that the girls were being systematically poisoned with substances that clouded their minds and weakened their bodies. Most shocking of all was Margaret's theory about the true purpose of the academy, based on overheard conversations, observed behaviors, and the accounts of students who had undergone special instruction. She believed that St. Mary's Academy was not an educational institution at all, but rather an elaborate procurement operation designed to provide young women for the entertainment of wealthy and powerful men. The education and religious instruction were merely aids designed to maintain the academy's reputation, while the real business was conducted in the third-floor chambers under cover of darkness. "They're not just killing us, Miss Hartwell," Margaret concluded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "They're destroying us first. Our minds, our will, our ability to resist or escape. And then, when we're too weak to fight anymore, they use us until we die. Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, they didn't die of fever or brain sickness. They were murdered as surely as if someone had put a knife through their hearts." Constance listened to this account with growing horror and a sick certainty that Margaret's analysis was correct. Too many pieces of the puzzle fit together too perfectly for this to be the product of an overwrought imagination. The trembling hands, the clouded minds, the mysterious visitors, the rigid control over information and movement, all of it pointed to a conspiracy of almost unimaginable evil But even as she accepted the truth of Margaret's revelations, Constance understood the enormity of the challenge they faced. The Fairfax family was respected throughout Salem and beyond. Victoria was considered a pillar of Christian virtue. Evangeline was beloved for her musical talents and gentle demeanor, and Bartholomew's reputation as a powerful preacher had earned him admirers throughout New England. Accusations against such people, made by a working-class seamstress and a charity student, would be dismissed as slander born of jealousy or mental instability. They would need evidence. Concrete, undeniable proof of the crimes being committed at St. Mary's Academy, and they would need to obtain this evidence without alerting the Fairfax family to their suspicions, because both women understood that discovery would mean certain death. The Academy had already demonstrated its ability to eliminate inconvenient witnesses while maintaining its facade of respectability. As winter settled over Salem in 1813, two women began a dangerous game of cat and mouse with their captors, seeking the proof that could save the surviving students and expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. But they were not the hunters in this game. They were the prey, and their quarry possessed resources, connections, and ruthlessness that neither of them fully comprehended. The winter of 1814 transformed St. Mary's Academy into a battleground where two desperate women fought for evidence while their enemies closed in around them with increasing suspicion and hostility. Constance Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan had formed an unlikely alliance. An educated young woman from Boston's merchant class and an Irish orphan who had learned survival through suffering. But their different backgrounds proved to be an advantage as they developed a sophisticated intelligence operation within the Academy's walls. Their first breakthrough came through Constance's legitimate access to the Academy's administrative areas. As an instructor, she was permitted to use Victoria Fairfax's office during certain hours to prepare lesson plans and grade assignments. During these sessions, she began to systematically examine the files and documents that Victoria kept in her locked desk, a task made possible by Margaret's childhood skills at picking locks, learned during her desperate months on Salem streets before entering the Academy. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears. Hidden beneath conventional academic records and correspondence were detailed ledgers that recorded financial transactions, unlike anything a legitimate educational institution would maintain. The entries were written in a coded system, but the pattern became clear once they understood the underlying structure. Each student was assigned a number, and their progress was tracked through a series of evaluations that had nothing to do with academic achievement. Margaret's blood ran cold when she found her own entry, subject 120 ms a red-green, 15 years, conditioning progressing slowly, resistance above average, recommend increased dosage and extended isolation periods, client interest moderate but consistent, estimated transition to final phase, 3 to 4 months. The clinical detachment of these notes was perhaps more horrifying than outright cruelty would have been. The girls were not seen as human beings, but as inventory, tracked and managed with the same dispassionate efficiency that a merchant might use to catalog bolts of cloth or barrels of flour. Worse still, the ledgers contained client preferences that read like a catalog of human depravity. Certain men preferred younger girls, others specified physical characteristics, and some had requested particular temperaments. She, defiant, or what was euphemistically described as broken. But the most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Victoria Fairfax and her clients. These letters, written in Victoria's elegant handwriting, discussed arrangements with a frankness that left no doubt about the Academy's true purpose. One letter, dated November 15, 1813, addressed to someone identified only as the Honorable J.A., contained details that made both women feel physically ill. My dear friend, I am pleased to inform you that the young lady you inquired about has made significant progress in her preparation. The temperament issues you mentioned have been largely resolved through our specialized instruction methods, and I believe she will meet your exacting standards within the fortnight. As always, our mutual discretion ensures that your association with our institution remains entirely confidential. Your usual contribution of $200 will be most gratefully received. The systematic nature of the operation became clear as they uncovered more documents. The Academy served as a procurement and conditioning center for a network of wealthy clients throughout New England and beyond. The girls were not simply exploited, they were systematically broken down through a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and physical abuse until they became compliant victims who could be rented to clients or sold outright to those willing to pay premium prices. The death of students like Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine was not accidental, but part of the business model. Girls who proved too resistant to conditioning, who became too ill to be profitable, or who posed security risks were eliminated with carefully administered overdoses of laudanum and other substances. Their deaths were then attributed to natural causes, with Dr. Edmund Fairfax providing the necessary medical certifications to avoid official investigation. As Constance and Margaret gathered this evidence, they became increasingly aware that their own activities were being monitored. Victoria Fairfax had always been observant, but her scrutiny of Constance's behavior became more intense and pointed. During faculty meetings, Victoria would ask seemingly innocent questions about Constance's lesson plans, her interactions with students, and her impressions of the Academy's educational methods. But beneath the polite inquiry, Constance could sense a predatory intelligence, evaluating her responses for signs of suspicion or disloyalty. The pressure increased dramatically in January of 1814, when another student died under circumstances that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. Elizabeth Morrison, a 14-year-old from a poor farming family, had been at the Academy for only 4 months when she was found dead in her bed on a Tuesday morning. Unlike the previous deaths, which had been attributed to fever or brain sickness, Elizabeth showed no signs of illness before her death. She had simply failed to wake up, as if her life had been quietly extinguished during the night. Dr. Edmund Fairfax's examination of the body was perfunctory, lasting less than 10 minutes,